All right, let's jump right in. In this explainer, we're cracking open a text that's basically a roadmap to the complex world of early Islamic theology. We're going to see how one single faith gave rise to a whole bunch of different schools of thought, and we'll dig into the key ideas that both united and divided them. Let's get started.
So here's the game plan. We'll kick things off by looking at how all these diverse views popped up from a single faith. Then we'll nail down a definition for the people of the Sunnah and walk through their 10 core beliefs. After that, we'll map out the other major groups and really compare the big theological disagreements. Let's dive in. You have to wonder, how does one faith branch out into so many different interpretations? Well, according to the source we're looking at, over time, different groups started forming around really distinct theological ideas. Now, this wasn't about starting new religions or anything like that. It was all about debating the very heart of their shared faith, which, as you can imagine, led to some profoundly different ways of understanding the core principles. This quote from the source paints a really powerful picture. It's this idea of one straight, correct path, with all these other paths branching off to the side. And this metaphor, this concept of a single true path versus many deviations, is totally central to the entire argument the author's making. Okay, so if there's a straight path, what does it actually look like, at least according to our source? This brings us to a really crucial term, al-sunnah wal jama'ah. To understand all the other groups, we first have to get a handle on this one, which the text sets up as our baseline. So, al-sunnah wal jama'ah literally translates to the people of the prophetic tradition and the community. In this text, this group is presented as the mainstream, the orthodox position. So for the rest of this breakdown, we're going to use their beliefs as the benchmark to see how all the other groups compare. So what does it actually mean to be part of this group? The text is pretty clear on this. It doesn't just leave it up to interpretation. It lays out 10 very specific tenets that, according to the author, are the absolute hallmarks of Ahl-Sunnah. Let's break them down. These first 5 are fascinating because you can see they're mixing politics with actual religious practice. They start with leadership, right? Emphasizing loyalty to the first 4 caliphs. Then it shifts to rituals, like honoring Mecca and Jerusalem. But pay close attention to the last 2 here. There's this huge emphasis on community unity. The idea that you should pray with any Muslim, no matter how pious you think they are. I mean, in an era of intense division, that was a really powerful statement about inclusivity. And the next 5 tenets keep building this picture. You see a principle of not getting involved in politics, not rebelling against rulers, which was probably a reaction to all the civil wars happening. Then you have points on ritual purity, but the really big ones are the theological stances, a belief in predestination, this idea that everything is subject to God's will, and the crucial principle that you absolutely cannot judge whether a specific person is going to heaven or hell. That's for God alone to decide. And then it all comes back to the basics, the core duties of prayer and charity. It's this very pragmatic mix of politics, ritual, and theology. Okay, now that we've got the baseline established, let's look at those other paths. The source doesn't just define the mainstream. It goes to great lengths to document all the groups it sees as being on those divergent paths we heard about in that first quote. This gives you a sense of just how many groups the author is talking about. It's like this complex family tree of early Islamic thought, with different factions and even sub-factions branching off. This wasn't just a handful of different opinions. It was a super vibrant and often very heated intellectual scene where people were debating the very nature of faith itself. Now, we can't possibly cover every single group listed, but our source zeroes in on these 6 as being particularly important. Their views on key issues are a sharp contrast to the baseline we just set up, and they really help us understand the major fault lines in these early theological debates. And this brings us right to the heart of it. How exactly did these groups differ from the Ahl-Sunnah? Let's put their views side by side on some of the most fundamental questions of the day. This table really lays it all out. The contrasts are just stark. On the issue of the Prophet's companions, you have the Ahl-Sunnah position of reverence versus the Rafidi, who the text says cursed them. Or take the issue of a major sinner. The Khawarij would say they're no longer a believer at all, a pretty radical stance. The Ahl-Sunnah argue, no, they're still a believer, just a sinful one. And then you get to the huge debate over free will, where the Ahl-Sunnah are trying to find a middle ground between 2 absolute extremes, which we're about to get into. Let's just zoom in on that free will debate for a second because it's so fundamental. On one extreme, you have the Jabriya. As the text describes them, they believe humans are completely compelled, with no real choice in what they do. And on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have the Qadariya, who argue that humans are fully independent creators of their own actions, almost outside of God's will. This spectrum just shows you how profoundly different the understanding of human choice and divine power could be.
And here's another totally unique perspective, this time from the Murji'a. The source quotes them as believing that faith is completely unaffected by sin, which is a massive contrast to the Khawarij, who would kick a sinner out of the faith entirely. It also points out their different stance on marriage. This is a perfect example of how these theological debates weren't just abstract ideas. They had real-world consequences for law, for society, and for daily life. So, in the end, this map of belief from our source text leaves us with a pretty powerful question to chew on. This isn't just a list of who believed what. It's an act of creating an identity, of drawing lines between us and them. And that brings up a much broader point. How do foundational texts, in any tradition, end up shaping both a community's sense of who they are and how they view everyone else? Thanks for joining me for this one.